In 2013, I co-facilitated a Unitarian Universalist faith development curriculum called Beloved Conversations. The curriculum helps participants have conversations about race and faith that engender love and joy. Really? I'm guessing many of you have at some point been involved in conversations about race and faith that did not engender joy. But while these beloved conversations were not easy, they did facilitate real and joyful connections among the participants in them. They prompted transformative revelations among participants about privilege, power, and perception. In today's climate of polarization, any foray into conversations about race is fraught. To be fair, though, in the United States, conversations about race have been pretty fraught since the beginning. We just have our own special 21st century version of fraughtness. For some folks, this is tiring. Why do we have to keep talking about this? It just makes us feel bad. While for other folks, it's been a long time coming. Why are we just now having community conversations about race and white supremacy when it's been 400 years since the first African people enslaved by members of the British colonies arrived in the Americas? Regardless of where you are in the range of exhaustion, I think it's safe to say that exhaustion exists all over the place. Racism and white supremacy is one of the deepest wounds in our country. It's a wound that began with the nation in Manifest Destiny's systematic genocide of Native American people, and in the extraordinary national wealth accumulated through our founders' dependence on systematically enslaving human beings to violently extract their forced labor. The depths of the wounds has reverberated throughout our history as a nation, through our ancestors and through our own families, through our very bodies. Of course, we are tired. The pain runs really deep. So how is it possible to touch that wound and feel connection, even feel love, even feel joy? It's natural as human beings to seek pleasure and to avoid pain. It's a human instinct that perpetuates the species. This normal impulse can manifest in avoiding any conversations about race because it is too painful to touch this ugly, old American wound. But it can also manifest as the instinct to touch the wound in order to heal it. Ultimately, in the long run, the pain will be reduced by going into it, by facing it, by doing the hard and uncomfortable and even painful long-term work of healing. Sometimes I think of it like going to physical therapy to heal your body after it's experienced some sort of trauma. One of our members, who's a physical therapist, explained her job to me like this. I'll have a patient say, "It hurts when I do this." And then I say, "Oh yeah?" Physical therapy is not fun. Sometimes it's really uncomfortable. Sometimes it downright hurts. Sometimes you hate it. And yet you go because you value your body and its long-term health, and you make the commitment to heal. Now, physical therapy doesn't ask you to re-wound yourself. It doesn't say, oh, this hurts. Rather, it asks you to practice discomfort on a regular schedule, to stretch, to work, to be with the feelings that come up in order to heal the wound. When faced with the choice of either doing physical therapy or never healing, most people choose to do the uncomfortable work because we value the well-being of our bodies. What if we turned that same level of attention and commitment to the well-being of our souls? But I promised you joy, didn't I? Not just discomfort or hard work, but actual joy. In meaningful conversations about race and faith, in my experience, the joy comes from without and from within. By investigating one's own experiences with race, which is so deeply a part of our national reality, one gains a greater ability to authentically connect by coming to know oneself, one's history, and one's nation more clearly. Also, being able to acknowledge and affirm differences in experience as well as similarities helps us learn how to build honest and real relationships. The deepening of authenticity and connection brings real joy. Joy also comes from purposefully connecting with other people about what really matters. Meaningful conversations about race can also cultivate joy within. That joy comes from deeper self-knowledge, from greater capacity to explore one's own history, and from more access to all of the parts of who you are, where you come from, and the multivalent meanings of your experiences in the world. Instead of just skipping over the place where it hurts, instead of adjusting one's body and movements to accommodate the wound, you can learn to access the wound and integrate it into your body. There is joy in greater authenticity and knowledge of self, including the sore parts, the tender parts, the deeply angry parts, the shamed or humiliated parts. Integrating all of our parts gives us greater access to ourselves, which is ultimately joyful. When we had these beloved conversations, when I was serving as the ministerial intern at Unity Church, Unitarian, our hard work to be present to truth even when it was uncomfortable, to return in regular practice to stretching and strengthening, bloomed into authentic connections, deeper self-awareness, and joy. The conversations that we had with one another revealed our souls. We shared our family histories and things that we cared about. We talked about our deep wounds, our shame and our anger around racism and white supremacy. And we shared our faith, what held us up when things got hard, how we held out hope for a better future in the face of great cruelty and suffering. We admitted to our grief and our sense of hopelessness, and together, through the sharing, we felt our collective power. Because together, we built real connections that were based on honesty and knowing ourselves more deeply. That strengthened us. It strengthened our relationships, and it strengthened our commitment enough to hold us through the mistakes and the hurt and the harm that came up in the conversations. In the United States, with this deep wound of systemic racism and culture of whiteness as the ideal, conversations about race will include mistakes. They will include hurt, and they will include harm. Knowing this, sometimes folks choose to avoid talking about race rather than expose themselves to that kind of harm or make mistakes and cause harm themselves, which is understandable. And I wonder what would happen if we focused on the possibilities for good instead of the possibilities for harm, which are real. What if the first place our mind went when we think about conversations about race and white supremacy was, what is the best thing that could happen in this conversation? What might I be able to learn? What might I be able to learn from the person I'm talking to? What might I be able to learn about myself? What kind of connection could come out of this conversation? And how might my life become better as a result? How might I learn to contribute to becoming a better member of the church? How might we together become a better church or a better city or a better country? What kind of powerful opening might this conversation create in my own soul? Neuroscience has shown that we can shape our thought patterns. Neurons that fire together wire together, which means that the more often you think a particular thought in response to a particular external stimulus, the more likely you are to think that same thought in response to that same stimulus again in the future. Our brains create superconductor highways of neurons for the thoughts that we think the most often. And because those neurons are running along a superconductor highway, those thoughts arise more quickly in response to an event than thoughts that we think less often. In an American culture that's steeped in white supremacy and racism, that reality of how our brains work leads to something that's called implicit bias, or the attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in an unconscious manner. Implicit bias comes from just breathing the air in a nation that is full of stereotypes. It does not necessarily require your consent. Intentional, explicit discrimination does require your consent, but an individual's implicit bias doesn't necessarily predict an individual's intentional discrimination. But it doesn't mean that implicit bias isn't there just because a person doesn't act on it. What studies have shown is that levels of implicit bias in groups of people can predict, on average, group patterns of behavior. For example, according to a study referenced by the Scientific American, cities with greater average implicit bias, so the group has a greater average implicit bias, have larger racial disparities in police shootings. The reality is that we are all biased. Pattern recognition and stereotyping is part of how human beings learn. It's part of how our brains work, and it's part of what the United States culture has taught us all of our lives. However, in a society in which the systems of power and wealth are systematically held by white people, and in which the culture supports white cultural values and whiteness as superior, then implicit bias as well as explicit bias, combined with systemic power, creates racism. In May of last year, May of 2018, 2 black pastors from Milwaukee were driving through Waukesha on their way home from a boating trip when their boat got a flat tire. Pastors John Patterson and Demetrius Williams pulled over to the side of the highway and they called their insurance company for help. While they were waiting there, a Waukesha County Sheriff's deputy pulled up behind them with his lights flashing. He came up to the car, and after the pastors told Deputy Eric Michelson that they were waiting for help to arrive for their flat tire, Michelson asked them if they had any guns or drugs in the car. Pastor Williams was confused. He wondered why they were being questioned like they were criminals when they had not even been pulled over by this police officer, but they were on the side of the road waiting for help. Pastor Williams said, "Sir, we are both pastors. We wouldn't have anything like that." The deputy took their driver's licenses anyway and ran a background check on them. When he didn't find anything, he came back to the boat with an orange abandoned vehicle sticker and stuck the abandoned vehicle sticker on the boat, even though they were clearly still there with it, and went away. Now, through the deputy's actions, we can see what might have been implicit bias move into intentional action of discrimination. Individual cases contain many different variables, but it's easy when we look at the big picture to see patterns. According to the Stanford Open Policing Project's analysis of 100 million different traffic stops across the United States, Black and Hispanic drivers are twice as likely to be searched as white drivers. White drivers have a pattern of experience with the police that is different than the patterns of experience of Black and Hispanic drivers. And I've certainly noticed that pattern in my own interactions with police officers. And although I've had a number of encounters with police, and I have even been pulled over a few times, sorry to tell you that, this white woman has never had her car searched. Just last week, I was driving with a friend. Actually, my friend was driving. She's another white woman and also a pastor up in Murray Hill when we found a parking spot on the side of the street. It was Murray Hill, so there were not a lot of parking spots, and the cars were parked very close to one another. And my friend, the pastor, God love her, cannot parallel park. She can't. So I offered to do it, and she was like, yeah, okay. And with the car running, we both opened our doors and ran around the car, a little ring around the car, and I got into the driver's seat to parallel park. Of course, as it always happens, someone else pulled up behind us right as we were jumping out and running around the car, and they were impatiently waiting for us to move. Their lights were a little distracting to me in the dark, so I rolled down my window and I started waving them forward, but they didn't move. So finally I threw open my door and I was waving them forward, and eventually the car pulled up and it was a police car. The officers said, "Everything okay here?" And I was like, yeah, I was just trying to get this parking spot. And they laughed and drove away. No one asked me for my driver's license or whether I had any guns or drugs in the car, or why I had gotten out of a running vehicle in the middle of the street and changed drivers. While 2 stories do not a pattern make, 100 million traffic stops do. And we tell stories like this to illustrate big picture data. When cities have higher implicit bias levels, Black and brown people are more likely to get stopped, they're more likely to be searched, and they're more likely to experience violence from the police. Both implicit bias and intentional discrimination are very real, and they are very present in today's world, and they're scary. They're frightening to people, and they're a real threat to people's lives and well-being. The good news is that it doesn't have to be this way. The good news is that we can move from the implicit bias that is trained into us as Americans through the system and the culture of white supremacy. We can train our brains to have different associations. But in order to do that, we have to be willing to dedicate the time and the energy and the resources, the attention to the conversations and the reality of the experience to change our brains so that we can change the reality of living in this country. Over 50 years after the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s historic leadership calling us to be a better nation, as a people we still struggle. We struggle deeply with racism and white supremacy. There is so much work to do. There's work to do at the systemic level, work to do at the institutional level, work to do at the cultural level, and work to do at the personal level, work to do just inside of our own brains. Knowing all of that, it can feel overwhelming, it can feel exhausting, it can feel insurmountable. But what if instead of being exhausted and afraid, we asked ourselves, what's the best thing that could happen here? What's the best thing that could happen by going into this conversation, by having this sermon that's about the realities of differences in policing? What's the best thing that could happen by calling attention to the wound? What kind of healing might be possible? What might happen if we devoted regular spiritual practice to the deep wound of racism and white supremacy in the same way that we would do regular physical therapy to heal our bodies? Even though the story of Pastor Williams and Pastor Patterson is disheartening, the other part of that story is that the pastors are working right now to organize. They're working with Common Ground to change the reality of racial profiling by the police in Waukesha. Common Ground is gathering data to point to a pattern of racial profiling by the Waukesha police, gathering stories from white people and people of color that are intended to demonstrate the bigger picture. Members of faith communities of different races and ethnicities are working together to change the system. People are getting to know one another and building real relationships in the service of justice. In fact, if you want to get involved in this kind of work, George is on our Common Ground core team. He'll be at the guest table during coffee hour, and other members of our Common Ground core team will be at the social justice table during coffee hour. There is joy in the work for justice. There's joy in real relationship. There is joy in the commitment to do and to be and to make it better. There is joy in talking honestly about race and faith in this country because it creates the possibility for deeper love and connection. I invite you to join me in this joy. May it be so.